Hey guys, Kevin Cleary with a knife video. Got a very popular blade for you today. This is the SOG Flash 2. Now, the Flash series is probably, and I don't think I'm being very speculative by guessing that this is SOG's best seller. It's one of those knives you just kind of associate with the name SOG. I think in most Walmarts, especially in the US and maybe even in Canada, you could pick up this knife off the shelf at Walmart. It's fairly affordable, and it does have a lot of those sort of interesting tactical features that guys like to see, such as the piston lock, sometimes called the arc lock, but it's not really an arc lock, the assisted opening, the various options, you know, the jimping in various places, the textured handle, this sort of technical look, and this is also available in a bunch of different options, like different colored handles, different blade shapes, different blade coatings, serrated, non-serrated, all kinds of different things are out there for this particular blade. And for all of those reasons, okay, it's a pretty popular knife. Now, I think one of the things that makes this popular is the size and weight, and we're going to go to that in a second. Before that, I should say, this is also a pretty affordable knife, all right? Blade HQ, I think they want 50 bucks, but pretty much anywhere else you're paying between $30 and $40. I'm not sure why Blade HQ has a higher price. That's kind of odd for them. But shop around, you can pick these up for a very reasonable price. Now we'll speak to that in a second when I get to comparisons before we go through the rest of the review. But why don't we give you the size and weight right off the bat so that we kind of know what we're dealing with. 8 inches overall, okay, so this is an 8-inch knife, which is right there in that sort of nice size range that we like to see. 3.5-inch blade, 4.5-inch handle. And here's the thing that really stands out about this knife, and probably one of the reasons it's so popular. This knife weighs only 3.1 ounces. So that's a real achievement, okay? And even though I will have some complaints about that, that is not one of them. SOG has done a really good job keeping the weight on this knife very reasonable. Now, before we go into the blade and deployment and all that kind of stuff, I've got some other knives here that I think you probably want to consider. If you're watching this video because you're saying, hey, should I buy a SOG Flash 2? I'll speak to some specifics later, but there are some knives I think you should probably be considering as well. Some of them you'll probably know about, maybe some of them you won't. First off is the Kershaw Blur. Now the Blur is a little bit more expensive in certain variations. It's a lot more expensive in some variations, but in the standard 14C28N version, the Blur can be had for around $40, between $40 and $50 for sure, and the SOG is like between $30 and $40. So it's only 10 bucks more, and you're getting quite a lot more knife, in my estimation, with a Kershaw Blur. Okay, so that's probably an option you'll want to consider. A knife that comes in at the same or maybe even cheaper price point, but is a little bit larger, is the Rat Model 1. Now the Rat Model 1 is also a lot tougher. So if you're thinking, hey, this is a knife that I'm going to be doing some really hard use stuff with, bushcraft stuff, then you may want to look toward the Rat Model 1, and you could even look toward the Rat Model 2 and have something close. You can see how the Flash is quite a bit smaller. The Rat 2 is going to be smaller still than the Flash, but not a lot smaller, okay? So the Rat 1 is definitely going to be an option worth comparing. And of course, this is such a common knife that you may be familiar with it and want to know, hey, where does the Flash land in terms of size? Well, there it is beside a very common knife to give you an idea. Another SOG that is really a very similar knife, okay? Extremely similar. Similar size, similar weight. The only thing that's different really is the blade shape, and so if you prefer one of these blade shapes over the other, that's going to be the deciding factor. But the SOG Aegis has the same operation, it has about the same weight. The difference is largely going to be that leaf-shaped blade versus more traditional drop point. And you know, both of these are great. I do like the Aegis just a little bit better, but it is discontinued. And I think the Aegis is going to cost you just a little bit more. Not a lot more, but a little more. Another knife that you want to consider probably is the Ontario Utilitac. And this is closer in size than the Rat 1. And you know, this is almost, the construction on this is the same as a Rat Model 1. It's just a different shape. And so maybe you maybe aesthetically you like this shape a little better. And this, I think, is a very good option as well. It's not assisted, but it is very durable, like extremely. So if you're want a knife that, you know, you might put through a washing machine and expect it to work when it comes out, I would be looking at this over something like this. A couple more here. One is if you're, you know, if you're willing to go up a little bit in price, you can look at a cold steel American Lawman. This is the AUS-8A version of the American Lawman, and right now you can get a pretty good deal on these because these have been phased out in favor of a slightly newer model with better blade steel. Now the newer model is about $100, but these guys can be had for much less, probably around 50, okay? And this is a very, very good knife and probably the most durable, you know, the toughest knife that I have shown you so far in these comparisons. Two other knives that I want to show you. One is this Meyerco Shockwave. It's a Kirby Lambert collaboration with Meyerco. Meyerco has a few of these knives out, and for a very, very reasonable price, I've been extremely impressed with the level of quality. Now you may get some fit and finish issues on these, but no more than you'll get on these. But you're getting a fairly well constructed blade here, and one that looks a little classier. There's a little bit, you know, this leans a little more toward a hard, leans a little bit more toward like a gentleman's folder, although it's going to serve just as well in pretty much anything that the SOG is going to do. This will do just fine for you, although it's not, of course, assisted. One other knife that I'll share with you real quickly. This is the Cold Steel Swift, and the reason I have this one out is because it's assisted opening, and this is assisted opening with a super strong locking mechanism. So if you like the assist on the Flash, you want a fast, hard assisted knife with a lock that you can really, really count on, the Swift is a great knife. And for those of you who, you know, have been watching recently and are waiting for the review, I think by about next week I'll put a review out of the Swift. Now, let's get back to the Flash 1 and talk about the things that I like and the things that I dislike now that you've got some context for where this fits. And by the way, that's only a small sampling of the knives that are out there. We could add like the Tenacious series from Spyderco. You know, we could add quite a number. We could add a bunch of Kershaws, like a long list of Kershaws. And so those are just some of the knives that I have that compare to this, but there are literally hundreds of knives in this part of the market where, you know, they're sort of $30 to $45 reasonably good quality folding knives. Okay, I call them sort of middle budget. You know, they're kind of the high end of the budget for someone who's not into knives. Okay, very, very competitive part of the market to be in. Okay, so that's where the Flash lands. It has a lot of competition, and that does make a buying decision very difficult. All right, so now that we know about what else is out there and that there's even more that I can't even begin to scratch the surface of, let's specifically talk about this knife, what I like and what I dislike. So number one, the blade shape. And the blade and the shape of the blade is very good. And one thing, you know, I said I'd give SOG credit when it's due. SOG knows how to heat treat AUS-8 steel, okay? They have a number of blades in AUS-8, and although I sometimes wish it was better quality steel, especially for the price point that some of these come in at, the AUS-8 that SOG puts out is very, very good, okay? Better, you know, better than other AUS-8s that I've used. And I've used, you know, AUS-8 from CRKT, from Cold Steel, from lots from Ontario, and of course from SOG and a few others, okay? And I've got to tell you, you know, SOG does a great job with heat treating this AUS-8 steel. So you're going to get really, really good performance out of it. Better than all of those others. Maybe not better than all of them, but certainly, you know, in my mind, better than Cold Steel and better than Ontario, okay? So the blade is very good for the price point. It is a full flat grind with a drop point, which is an extremely utilitarian blade shape, all right? It's just versatile. It can do all kinds of different things and do all of those different things pretty well, which is really nice. Why don't we go ahead and zoom in here for a few minutes so you can take a better look at that blade. I say that, now let's hope remote works for me. Okay, so there's that full flat ground drop point blade in Aus-8 steel. Very, very sharp. It comes sharp from SOG. It takes a good edge, and it does hold that edge really well. Okay, so as I say, got to give SOG credit for doing a very good job with the heat treat on that Aus-8 steel. And of course, this is just a really utilitarian blade shape. Okay, it's just, you know, you got enough belly, you've got enough flat, it's a drop point. Pretty much anything you want to do with a knife, this blade shape is going to do it just fine. And with this more traditional drop point, okay, where you get the blade sweeping up toward the tip, you get a little more strength. When you look at the Aegis, where there's a slight difference here in the way this tip is achieved, there's very little steel out here, guys. This is really, really thinly ground at the tip. This is a more thickly ground tip, which means you're going to be a little more durable on the flash than the Aegis, especially if you drop it or if you stab into something hard. Okay, so that's the blade. Very good blade shape, very utilitarian blade shape, and in my mind, very good performance, or in my experience, very good performance out of this Aus-8A blade from SOG. Now, the next thing we want to talk about, and this is where things get a little tougher, is deployment. So this uses a coil spring, which does work really well and really fast. So I have no complaints at all with a coil spring. Certainly, it's going to be dependable. It's going to be a spring that is going to last for a very long time, and you're probably not going to be sending this one back to SOG to replace the spring. Although, when we're talking about deployment, that's where we do have an issue. Okay, this lock is called a piston lock. It looks like an arc lock. Okay, and on an arc lock, there's this bar moving back and forth on a pivot at the top, and it pivots into the back of the blade the way an axis lock works. Okay, this looks like it's an arc lock because of the way it moves in sort of an arc shape, but it is not an arc lock. Inside of here, what you're moving is sort of a plastic arm back and forth, and that little plastic arm engages something into the back of the blade tang, which locks the knife in place. Okay, it's sort of like if you've ever had a bullpup gun apart. You know how the trigger is attached to an arm that actually fires, releases the firing pin. Well, that's kind of what's happening here. You've got an arm inside of here, and the arm pushes a little piece into the blade. So the reason I go through all that description is to point out that this lock does not work nearly as well as the actual arc lock. Okay, an actual arc lock is actually a really good lock. Sure, it's a copy of the Benchmade Axis lock, no question about that, but it's a fairly good copy and it works pretty well without infringing on the copyright. This, on the other hand, is a copy of the copy of the arc lock, and it does not work very well. I have held a number of these blades. I've talked to people who own them. I've even been in forums to discuss this. There are very few piston locks that don't have blade play. Okay, and I don't mean side to side. This has no blade play side to side, and that I'll give SOG credit for, but it does have up and down blade play because this lock does not work very well. On the SOG Aegis, guess what? Same problem, up and down blade play. Now it's considerably less on my Aegis, but the Aegis costs quite a bit more. And if you were one of those guys who paid $70 or $80 when these first came out, you must have been really disappointed in that up and down blade play. For a much cheaper knife, okay, for a knife that costs around 40 bucks, can you forgive blade play? Well, as far as I'm concerned, no, you can't, because I've shown you all those other knives that are around the same price point, and guess what? None of them have blade play. It's only the ones with this piston lock, okay? So the piston lock is my one and only big problem with this knife, all right? Everything else could have been overlooked and you could give this a glowing recommendation, but because of this poor lock, this knife, I would probably steer most people away from it, other than to say, and I'll come back to this when I do an overview, everything else is really good, okay? It really is. But most knife guys just cannot tolerate that blade play, and certainly I am one of those guys. So I kind of use this as a beater knife just because I can't stand having a knife in my pocket where when I deploy it, it's got up and down blade play, and it's fairly severe up and down blade play. So that's my big issue with the knife. Otherwise, the lock does work, okay? It's not my favorite locks. It can be a little tough to get your finger on, but it's certainly not the end of the world. There are other locking mechanisms that I like better. There are some locking mechanisms that I don't like as much. It's not so much the mechanism, it's not the operation, it's the execution. It just doesn't lock the blade securely in place, so it allows for a little bit of blade play. Now, when I say it's not locked securely, I'm not suggesting this could close on you. In fact, I'm fairly satisfied having taken this apart and looked at how it works. It will not close. The lock is trustworthy. It's just not good fit and finish, so that it doesn't. The parts, there's too much loosey-goosey stuff going on in this whole lock mechanism in general. Now, let's move on to the handle, because the handle on this again goes back to the good side of things. It's a very comfortable handle. Even though it's small, you can see that it's fairly thin, and sometimes with a thin handle you get some issues with comfort. Not so with this. It's actually really comfortable. The grip is really good. The texturing on this FRN, like a fiber reinforced nylon, or it's basically a reinforced plastic material. It is very grippy, and I would not have any concerns at all about losing this knife or not being able to hold on to it if it was a little wet or whatever, and I have done that and had no problem. So grip is very good. No complaints whatsoever about anything there. The handle does feel a little kind of cheap, which is often the case with these plastic handles, or I mean FRN handles. But it's really not, okay? It's really stronger than it kind of feels in hand. It's a very durable material. And of course, what you're getting for, the reason it feels a little cheap is just because it's very lightweight, okay? So that anything really lightweight, we can sometimes perceive as being, not as strong. Now, having said all that, I would not see this as a hard use knife, okay? I would not want to pound on this really hard. I wouldn't want to put it through some of the things that I would put, say, my American Lawman through, or even my Rat Model 1 through. But it is more than capable of any kind of EDC tasks that you might need to do with it. Because it's assisted, it does have a lock on it, and so the lock is neither here nor there for me. Some people get really upset that a knife has a lock. I mean, it's there. It works manually, so if you don't like it, don't use it, If you do like it, then go ahead and use it. It's totally up to you. And I've never had this, lock in my pocket when I didn't expect it to or anything like that. So, to me, it's not really a big deal that it has a lock, even though some people have complained. One last thing about the handle that we should talk about, and that is, oh, by the way, the structure of this knife is coming from the FRN material, okay? There's no structure, there's no metal structure really in this handle. There is some, but it's not contributing much to the strength of the knife. So, last thing we want to talk about is the pocket clip, and the pocket clip is a nice deep carry clip, but some have complained. Now, I haven't really had this issue except for one time. So in a whole year that I've owned and carried this knife around, only one time has it ever kind of hooked on my pants because my pants got up around the top of the handle. Generally speaking, that's not a big concern, okay? Although I know I have heard some guys comment that it happens to them every time. For me, it's only happened very, very rarely. Otherwise, it is nice to have that deep carry clip because the knife just totally disappears in your pocket. You really can't see any of the knife. And it is reversible to the opposite side if you needed or wanted to do that. So, that's my take on the SOG Flash 2. It's one of those knives that I really want to like. I think it's got a lot of things right, okay? And I think the design, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of comfort, in terms of blade shape, hey, A1, everything's a win. But that lock is just, it really needs to go. So if someone from SOG ever watches this video, what I really would love to see you guys do is just scrap the piston lock altogether, put an actual arc lock in these knives, and you would have a 10 out of 10. You would knock this thing out of the ballpark. Now, well, I say all that, I know the motivation to do that is very low because they're still selling by the thousands. And so what are you going to do, right? Even when something that's not that well made, if it sells a lot, there's very little motivation for the manufacturer to change anything about it. So there you go, guys. That's my take on the SOG Flash 2. It's a fine knife. It's a capable knife. But I cannot say it's a great knife because that lock, that blade play is just too bothersome for me. I cannot mentally deal with it. And I'm not saying it's going to fail. I'm not saying it can't be used. It just drives me crazy. And I think it's because, I know it's because of that poorly designed lock mechanism. So there you go, guys. Is the Flash 2 a good knife? It's a fine knife, but if you buy one of these, either, number one, go into a store and open every one and find the one that doesn't have any up and down blade play. Now, even if you do that, I can't promise you that after 100 flips it's not going to start developing blade play. On the other hand, if maybe you're a person who says, hey, I don't mind a little bit of blade play, I really like the fact that it opens fast, I like the lightweight, I like the way the handle looks or whatever, then of course go ahead and pick one up. You won't be disappointed because now you kind of know going in there's a chance that it's going to have blade play. Alright, so that's my take on the SOG Flash 2. Overall, a decent knife, and it could be a phenomenal knife. It could be a 10 out of 10, but it has that issue with essentially just a poorly executed lock mechanism. Talk to you later, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we will talk to you soon.